They measured her against the saloon doorframe and laughed before she ever said her name. Eleanor Hart stood 5 feet 11 inches tall in her stocking feet, just over 6 feet in her worn leather boots, and in that small timber town, that was enough to make her a spectacle. Too tall, the mail-order groom muttered, adjusting his hat as if her height were a personal insult. The words drifted through the dusty afternoon air, light as sawdust, sharp as splinters. Eleanor felt every eye on her, storekeepers, mill hands, women peering from behind lace curtains, waiting to see if she would shrink. She did not. She kept her back straight, shoulders square beneath a simple blue traveling dress, and bent only once to lift her single suitcase from the boardwalk. The pine-scented wind moved through town, carrying the steady thud of axes from the lumber camp a half-mile away, each strike echoing like a slow heartbeat. Mrs. Marjorie Pruitt, the town's matchmaker, cleared her throat and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There must have been a misunderstanding in the correspondence, she said, folding the letters that had brought Eleanor 2,000 miles by train and wagon. Misunderstanding. As if hope had been misaddressed. As if a woman could be returned like dry goods. Eleanor's gloved fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, lay a sealed letter with red wax, the last thing her father had pressed into her hand before she boarded the train in St. Louis. She hadn't opened it yet, not because she was afraid of what it said, but because once she did, there would be no turning back. The rejected groom stepped away first, embarrassed more by the crowd than by her height. Laughter followed him, uneasy and thin. Eleanor felt the sting, but she refused to let it settle. She had crossed state lines, an endless prairie under a sky that never seemed to end. She had watched the Mississippi shrink behind her like a fading memory. She would not be undone by a doorway and a man's small pride. Down at the edge of town, where the dirt road curved toward the logging camp, a broad-shouldered figure paused mid-swing. Caleb Granger, foreman of the North Ridge lumber crew, wiped resin from his palms and looked toward the commotion. He had seen storms roll in from 10 miles out, and trees fall where no one expected. He knew something about measuring strength. From where he stood, Eleanor looked like a pine that refused to bow to wind. Not fragile, not misplaced, just taller than the rest. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh-cut timber and something else. Change, quiet and certain. Eleanor turned from the saloon and stepped toward the road that led away from town, her boots striking the dust in steady rhythm. She did not know yet that by sunrise, the same men who laughed would be holding their breath, and the woman they dismissed as too tall would be the only one standing exactly where she was meant to be. The road out of town was only a mile long, but it felt farther with every step Eleanor Hart took beneath the late afternoon sun. Dust clung to the hem of her dress, and the sound of laughter still echoed faintly behind her, thinner now, carried away by the wind that smelled of pine sap and fresh timber. She did not look back. A woman who looked back invited pity, and she had not crossed half a continent for pity. The North Ridge lumber camp rose ahead of her in rough outlines against the sloping hills, smoke lifting in slow gray ribbons from cook fires, the steady rhythm of axes striking wood marking time like a metronome. Each strike was deliberate, strong, patient. Eleanor slowed as she approached the outer fence, feeling the weight of unfamiliar eyes again, though this time they were not mocking, only curious. Men paused mid-swing, shirts rolled to the elbow, boots planted firm in sawdust and earth. A stranger walking alone toward a lumber camp was a sight worth noticing. Caleb Granger stood near the largest stack of cut logs, his sleeves dusted with pale wood shavings, his broad frame outlined by the lowering sun. Up close, he was taller than most, but it was not his height that filled the space around him. It was steadiness, the kind that did not need to prove itself. He studied Eleanor the way he studied a tree before giving the order to cut, not for weakness, but for structure. She stopped a few feet from him, meeting his gaze without lowering her chin. The wind tugged at loose strands of her brown hair, but she did not smooth them down. "Are you hiring?" she asked, her voice even, carrying clear over the distant thud of axes. A few of the men exchanged glances. Hiring was not a word often spoken by women in camps like this. Caleb wiped his hands on a clean cloth and considered her. He noticed the calluses along her fingers where gloves did not fully hide them. He noticed the suitcase at her side, worn but cared for. He noticed that she did not fidget. "For what kind of work?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated only a second. "Any honest work. I can cook. I can keep books. I can sew torn coats and patch boots. I can read a ledger and add columns without a mistake." There was no plea in her tone, only fact. Caleb glanced toward the camp's small supply shack where stacks of unpaid invoices had been collecting dust for weeks. The owner, Ezekiel Crow, had little patience for numbers that did not suit him. The thought lingered. Behind them, a sudden gust of wind rolled down from the ridge, sharp and cool, rattling the tops of the pines. One of the younger men pointed toward the tree line where a freshly marked trunk swayed slightly. Its cut angled wrong, too shallow on one side. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. A tree that did not fall as expected could unsettle an entire morning's work. He looked back at Eleanor, who followed his gaze, assessing the lean, calculating the weight without speaking. Something in her expression shifted, not fear, but awareness. "You read land the way you read numbers?" Caleb asked. She nodded once. "My father taught me both." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of sap and the promise of something about to change. The wind did not wait for permission. It came down the ridge in a long, steady breath, bending the tops of the pines and stirring the loose sawdust at their feet. Caleb Granger narrowed his eyes at the marked tree swaying beyond the line, its cut uneven, its balance uncertain. He lifted one hand, and the axes fell silent one by one. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the noise had. Eleanor Hart stepped slightly forward without thinking, her gaze fixed on the lean of the trunk, measuring distance the way some people measured doubt. "It will not fall clean," she said softly, not loud enough to challenge, only loud enough to be heard. A few men shifted, unsure whether to laugh again, but Caleb did not smile. He followed her line of sight, then nodded once to the crew. They adjusted their ropes, corrected their stance, and stepped back farther than they first intended. The tree finally gave way in a long, controlled arc, settling into the clearing with a deep, echoing thud that rolled through the camp like distant thunder. No one cheered. They simply breathed out. Caleb looked at Eleanor again, not surprised, only certain. "You see angles," he said. She answered, "I see consequences." It was not pride. It was habit. Caleb gestured toward the supply shack. "Come inside," he said. The interior smelled of ink, paper, and resin. Ledgers lay stacked in uneven piles across a rough-hewn desk, numbers half-entered, columns trailing off where patience had failed. Eleanor set her suitcase down carefully, brushing dust from the tabletop before opening one of the books. Her fingers moved over the pages with quiet familiarity. Outside, the camp resumed its rhythm, but inside, time slowed. She read without speaking for several minutes, eyes scanning rows of figures that did not add up the way they should. Caleb watched her in silence, arms folded, waiting. At last she turned a page back and tapped a column lightly. "These totals are short by $12 here and $9 there," she said. Small amounts, but repeated every week. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. He knew whose handwriting filled those lines. Ezekiel Crow preferred margins that favored him. Eleanor did not accuse. She simply continued. "If this continues for a season, the men will lose more than they realize." The words hung in the air like a slow warning bell. Outside, the sky deepened toward evening, the light turning gold against the stacked logs. Caleb moved to the doorway and looked out over his crew, men who trusted his judgment more than they trusted the books. When he turned back, his voice was steady. "You said you could keep books without a mistake." Eleanor met his gaze. "I can." He considered her height once more, the straight line of her posture, the way she did not waver under scrutiny. "Then you start tomorrow at sunrise," he said. "Board and wages included." The wind pressed softly against the shack walls, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something steadier than chance. Eleanor reached down and finally lifted the sealed letter from her suitcase. She held it in her palm for a moment, then slipped it back inside without breaking the wax. "Not yet. Some doors were meant to open only after you had proven you belonged on the other side." Sunrise came cold and clean over North Ridge, laying pale gold light across the stacked logs and the thin veil of mist that clung to the ground. Eleanor Hart was already awake when the first axe struck wood. She had slept in the small bunkhouse room Caleb had offered, boots placed neatly by the door, suitcase tucked beneath the narrow bed like something that might still decide to leave. The camp stirred slowly, men rolling from blankets, fire crackling to life, the scent of coffee drifting into the morning air. When Eleanor stepped into the supply shack, the ledgers waited where she had left them, silent and unfinished. She removed her gloves, flexed her fingers once, and began. Columns straightened under her careful script. Totals aligned. Errors were not erased, only noted in the margin with quiet precision. Outside, the rhythm of labor continued, steady as breath. Around mid-morning, Ezekiel Crow rode in from town, his dark coat brushing dust from the saddle as he dismounted. He was a man who smiled with his mouth and measured with his eyes. He noticed Eleanor before he reached the shack. "You have hired help without consulting me," he said to Caleb, voice smooth but edged with something firmer beneath. Caleb did not shift his stance. "I hired skill," he answered. Crow's gaze traveled up Eleanor's height, as if calculating board feet from a standing tree. "I was not aware we needed more hands," he replied lightly. Eleanor did not look up from the ledger. "You needed accuracy," she said, her tone even. The air inside the shack felt smaller for a moment. Crow stepped closer to the desk and glanced down at the open pages. His smile thinned when he saw the neat annotations beside certain entries. "Small discrepancies," he said. "Nothing that concerns a lady." Eleanor closed the book gently and met his gaze without flinching. "Small discrepancies become large losses over time," she answered. "The men deserve to know what they have earned." Outside, the axes slowed again, not from command this time, but from attention. Word traveled quickly in a camp built on timber and trust. Caleb remained by the doorway, silent, steady as the posts that held the roof above them. Crow's eyes flicked between them, weighing pride against exposure. "You presume much," he said at last. Eleanor's voice did not rise. "I presume honesty." The words settled into the space like a stone in clear water. No splash, just depth. A breeze pushed through the open door, carrying the scent of sap and something sharper, the promise of change that did not shout its arrival. Crow straightened his coat and forced a laugh that did not carry. "Very well," he said. "If you are so certain, present your sums tonight." He turned and walked back toward his horse, boots leaving shallow prints in the dust. The camp resumed its work slowly, the rhythm altered but unbroken. Eleanor reopened the ledger, her movements calm, deliberate. Caleb watched her for a long moment before speaking. "You understand what you have done?" he said quietly. She nodded once. "I have stood up," she replied. The wind lifted again along the ridge, brushing through the tall pines that bent but did not break, and in that steady morning light, the woman they once measured by a doorway now measured something far greater. Evening settled over North Ridge like a held breath. The sky burned amber behind the tree line, and the scent of pine deepened as the air cooled. Inside the supply shack, lantern light flickered against rough plank walls while Eleanor Hart arranged the ledgers in a precise stack. She had rewritten every column, marked every inconsistency, and totaled each week with clean, deliberate strokes. Ink smudged faintly along the side of her hand, but her numbers did not waver. Outside, boots shuffled in the dirt as the men gathered closer than usual, drawn not by spectacle, but by something quieter. Curiosity. Caleb Granger stood just beyond the doorway, arms folded, posture calm, but unyielding. When Ezekiel Crow returned, he did not ride this time. He walked, as though choosing to meet the moment on level ground. "You wish to present your sums," he said, voice smooth as polished wood. Eleanor turned the ledger toward him without ceremony. "I did not wish," she replied evenly. "I prepared." The lantern cast steady light over the pages. Crow scanned the entries, his brow tightening as he reached. The margins she had marked in neat, unembellished script. $12 here. $9 there. Repeated. Accounted for. The silence stretched. One of the younger men shifted his weight, and the faint crunch of sawdust under his heel sounded louder than it should have. Eleanor did not look at the crew. She looked only at the book, at the truth written plainly in ink. "The totals owed equal $143 across the season," she said calmly. "Divided among the crew, that is not small." Crow exhaled through his nose, a sound close to laughter but without warmth. "Mistakes happen," he said. "Figures blur in long days." Eleanor closed the ledger gently. Mistakes repeat, she answered. Blurring does not. The word hung there, simple and solid. Caleb stepped forward then, not aggressively, only nearer. We will settle the difference, he said. It was not a threat. It was a decision. Crow's eyes flicked to the men gathered outside, their expressions no longer uncertain. Trust was not loud, but it was visible. He straightened his coat and adjusted his cuffs, as if smoothing fabric could smooth fact. Very well, he said at last. If numbers are your concern, we will correct them. He reached into his pocket and withdrew folded bills, counting them carefully beneath the lantern light. The sound of paper passing from hand to hand was soft, almost reverent. One by one, the men stepped forward, receiving what had always been theirs. No cheers followed. No raised voices. Only a shift in the air, as though something heavy had finally been set down. When the last dollar changed hands, Crow glanced once more at Eleanor, measuring her as he had before, but this time with something closer to caution than dismissal. You have made your point, he said quietly. Eleanor met his gaze without triumph. I stood where I was meant to stand, she replied. Crow left without another word, boots fading into the darkening path toward town. The lantern flames steadied again. Outside, the pines whispered in the cooling wind, tall and unwavering. Caleb looked at Eleanor, not with admiration alone, but with recognition. You changed more than numbers tonight, he said. Eleanor glanced toward the ridge where the trees met the sky. No, she answered softly. I only balanced what was already there. And in the hush that followed, the camp felt taller somehow, as though the very ground beneath it had risen an inch. Morning did not bring celebration to North Ridge. It brought routine. Axes rose and fell in measured rhythm. Boots pressed steady paths into damp earth, and smoke climbed straight into a sky washed pale blue. Yet something invisible had shifted overnight. The men worked with a quiet ease that had not been there before, shoulders less burdened, voices less guarded. Eleanor Hart noticed it from the doorway of the supply shack as she set fresh ink to paper. Trust, once restored, moved like light through timber, subtle but unmistakable. She had risen before dawn again, the sealed letter still resting in her suitcase beneath the narrow bunk. She touched it briefly that morning, fingertips grazing the red wax, then left it unopened. Some truths waited for their own hour. Caleb Granger approached the shack carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, steam rising in slow spirals. He handed one to her, without ceremony. You stood steady, he said quietly. Eleanor accepted the cup, warmth settling into her palms. So did you, she replied. There was no flourish in the exchange, only acknowledgement. Outside, the crew began hauling cut logs toward the riverbank where they would be floated downstream at week's end. A sudden call rose from the ridge, not sharp, but urgent enough to draw attention. Caleb turned toward the sound, scanning the slope where a supply wagon had stalled halfway up the incline. One wheel sunk deep into soft ground from the previous night's moisture. 2 men strained against the harness, but the wagon would not budge. Eleanor stepped beside Caleb, eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the angle of the hill and the weight distribution. If they pull straight, it will sink deeper, she said. Caleb did not question her. He called instructions across the distance, guiding the men to shift the load and brace planks beneath the wheel. Eleanor moved closer, skirts brushing sawdust, boots firm against uneven ground. She knelt without hesitation, pressing a flat board beneath the rim while the others steadied the wagon. Now Caleb signaled. The wagon eased forward inch by inch, free of the rut, without splintering or strain. The men exhaled in relief, glancing toward Eleanor with something new in their expressions. Not curiosity, respect. She rose, brushing dirt from her gloves, untroubled by the smudges. Ezekiel Crow watched from a distance. Near the edge of camp, his posture stiff, hands clasped behind his back. He said nothing, but silence could speak as clearly as speech. Eleanor felt his gaze, yet did not meet it. Instead, she turned toward the river, watching sunlight catch along the water's surface. Caleb stepped beside her once more. You read land as easily as numbers, he said. She allowed herself the faintest smile. Land does not lie, she answered. The wind carried that reply across the clearing, through the pines that stood tall against the ridge. Work resumed, steady and confident, the camp moving in quiet alignment. And though no one measured her against a doorway now, Eleanor stood just as straight, not taller than the others, but no longer diminished by them. The day stretched ahead bright and unclouded, and somewhere beneath the ordinary rhythm of axes and wheels, something lasting had begun to take root. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so steady it almost felt fragile, like thin ice that had not yet been tested. North Ridge moved with new alignment, axes striking in clean cadence, ledgers closing without hidden gaps, wages counted with open hands. Eleanor Hart worked from sunrise until the last lantern was dimmed, her script firm and unhurried, her presence no longer an interruption but a fixture. Men who once avoided her gaze now tipped their hats when stepping inside the shack. Not because she demanded it, because she had earned it. One late afternoon, as the sky softened toward copper and the river carried long reflections downstream, Caleb Granger leaned against the doorway, watching her total the week's figures. "Town will hear about this," he said quietly. Eleanor did not pause her writing. "Truth travels whether invited or not," she replied. He nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. The following morning proved her right. A wagon rolled up the camp road just past 10 o'clock, wheels crunching against gravel. Mrs. Marjorie Pruitt sat upright on the bench seat, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes scanning the camp with thinly veiled curiosity. She stepped down carefully, skirts gathered, and approached the shack as though entering unfamiliar territory. The men watched from a distance, not hostile, only observant. Eleanor looked up when the shadow crossed the threshold. There was no surprise in her expression, only recognition. "Miss Hart," Marjorie began, voice polished but uncertain around the edges. "I believe there may have been haste in earlier judgments." Eleanor closed the ledger and rested her palms lightly upon it. "There was clarity," she answered evenly. Marjorie's gaze flickered toward the orderly stacks of books, then toward Caleb standing just outside. "The gentleman who initially inquired about your correspondence has reconsidered," she said carefully. "He wishes to extend a renewed offer." Silence filled the room, thick but calm. Outside, a pine cone dropped somewhere in the trees, the sound small yet distinct. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of decision settle upon her shoulders, not heavy, only present. She thought of the train platform in St. Louis, of miles of prairie passing beneath steel wheels, of the red wax seals still unbroken in her suitcase. She thought of the doorway where laughter had measured her worth in inches. Then she thought of the ridge at sunrise, the clean line of trees standing tall without apology. "Please inform him," Eleanor said at last, her voice steady as the timber posts holding the roof above them, "that I have accepted employment elsewhere." There was no sharpness in her tone, only finality. Marjorie's lips parted as if to argue, but she found no footing. She nodded once and stepped back into the daylight, skirts brushing sawdust that did not cling. Caleb watched her wagon disappear down the road toward town before turning to Eleanor. "You closed that door," he said quietly. Eleanor met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "It was never meant to be mine," she replied. The wind moved through North Ridge again, bending the pines without breaking them, and in that steady hush, something unspoken began to take shape between the woman who had stood her ground and the man who had seen it first. The afternoon light lingered longer that day, stretching gold across the river until the water looked like hammered copper. North Ridge moved with quiet confidence, each swing of an axe deliberate, each log rolled with practiced coordination. Eleanor Hart stood at the edge of the clearing with a ledger tucked beneath her arm, watching the crew guide a line of timber toward the current. She was no longer an observer in borrowed space. She was part of the rhythm. Caleb Granger stepped beside her, boots pressing into damp soil near the riverbank. "You have made this place steadier," he said, not as flattery, but as fact. Eleanor's gaze followed the slow glide of logs into the water. "It was steady already," she answered softly. "It only needed balance." The wind shifted off the ridge, cooler now, carrying the faint promise of autumn weeks ahead. A shout rose from upstream, not alarmed, but urgent. One of the floating logs had turned crosswise near a shallow bend, halting the line behind it. The current pressed against the jam with quiet insistence. Caleb's men moved quickly but cautiously, stepping onto the bank to adjust poles and ropes. Eleanor studied the angle, the tension of water against wood. If they pushed from the left, The current will do the rest, she said. Caleb relayed the instruction without hesitation. The men shifted position, guiding rather than forcing. Within moments the log eased free, sliding forward and releasing the line behind it. A low murmur of relief passed through the crew. No applause, just acknowledgement. Eleanor exhaled, unaware she had been holding her breath. Caleb looked at her with a quiet smile that reached his eyes. You see what others miss, he said. She met his gaze steadily. I look where no one else bothers to. As twilight deepened, lanterns were lit along the camp perimeter, small circles of light against the gathering blue. Supper simmered over open flame, the scent of beans and bread mingling with pine and river air. Eleanor returned to the bunkhouse and knelt beside her suitcase. For the first time since arriving, she broke the red wax seal on the letter inside. The paper unfolded with a soft whisper. Her father's handwriting greeted her, steady and familiar. He had written of standing tall when others bent, of choosing work that respected the soul rather than comfort that diminished it. He had written that a woman's worth was not measured by the space she filled, but by the ground she refused to surrender. Eleanor read each line slowly, the lantern light flickering against her features. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and held it close for a moment before placing it back in the case. Outside, laughter rose softly from the cook fire, not mocking, not sharp, but warm. Caleb's voice carried among the others, steady as ever. Eleanor stepped back into the night air, taller not by inches, but by certainty. The ridge stood dark against a sky scattered with early stars, and, for the first time since stepping off that train weeks ago, she did not feel measured by any doorway at all. The next week arrived with a different kind of attention. Not from the trees, not from the river, from town. Word had traveled beyond the ridge, carried in quiet conversations at the general store and along the boardwalk where boots scraped dust into familiar grooves. North Ridge was paying fair. North Ridge was balanced. And at the center of that balance stood a woman no one laughed at anymore. Eleanor Hart felt it the moment she rode into town beside Caleb Granger on the supply wagon. Heads turned, not sharply, not cruelly, but with curiosity that had shifted into something else. Recognition. The same saloon doorway that once measured her height now framed her silhouette without comment. She did not look at it. She did not need to. Caleb stepped down first, offering his hand not because she required help, but because partnership is often shown in small gestures. She accepted, boots meeting the boardwalk with steady confidence. Inside the general store, Ezekiel Crow stood near the counter, speaking in low tones with the shopkeeper. He paused when he saw them enter. There was no open challenge in his posture, but neither was there ease. Eleanor moved toward the supply shelves, reviewing items against a folded list she had prepared the night before. Flour, lamp oil, ledger paper, harness straps. Practical things. Caleb spoke briefly with the clerk about the river shipment scheduled for Friday. The air held the faint tension of unspoken history, but it did not tighten. When Eleanor approached the counter with the final tally, she placed exact payment on the wood surface. Each bill and coin counted without hesitation. Crow watched the exchange, then spoke, voice measured. The camp seems prosperous. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. It is honest, she replied. The word landed without accusation, yet it carried weight. Crow inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a lesson learned in public. Outside, a pair of townsmen stood near the hitching post, the same men who had once smirked at her height. Now they nodded in greeting. Not exaggerated, not forced. Simple acknowledgement. Eleanor returned the gesture, neither warm nor distant. Neutral ground had been earned. As she and Caleb loaded the wagon, the afternoon sun angled low, casting long shadows across the boardwalk. You do not seem surprised, Caleb said quietly as they secured the flour sacks. Eleanor glanced toward the ridge visible in the distance, tall pines etched against open sky. Change is slow, she answered. But it comes. He studied her profile, the line of her jaw steady beneath the brim of her hat. You could have chosen easier ground, he said. Eleanor adjusted the final crate and climbed onto the wagon seat. Easier ground sinks, she replied softly. The horses stepped forward, wheels turning back toward North Ridge. Behind them, the town continued its afternoon routine, but something fundamental had shifted. A doorway once used to diminish had become just wood and frame. A measurement once spoken aloud had dissolved into irrelevance. As the wagon rolled up the familiar incline toward the camp, the wind lifted again through the trees, brushing Eleanor's hair back from her face. She sat taller not because she needed to prove it, but because she finally stood where she was not being measured at all. Autumn edged closer with each passing morning, brushing the ridge with cooler air and a sharper scent of pine. North Ridge moved with practiced confidence now, the camp no longer adjusting to Eleanor Hart's presence, but relying on it. Ledgers balanced before dusk. Wages were distributed without pause. River shipments ran on schedule. Even the horses seemed calmer, as though steadiness could travel down reins and into muscle. One afternoon, as clouds gathered in slow gray bands over the hills, Caleb Granger studied the sky longer than usual. "Storm before nightfall," he said quietly. The men quickened their pace, guiding the last cut logs toward higher ground away from the river's edge. Eleanor stood near the supply shack, watching the wind test the treetops. She felt the pressure shift, not dangerous, but demanding attention. "The lower stacks need bracing," she called out, voice carrying clear across the clearing. Caleb nodded immediately, relaying the instruction. Boards were secured. Ropes tightened. Lanterns moved inside before the first drop of rain struck the dust. When the storm finally broke, it did not roar. It pressed steadily, rain falling in firm sheets that blurred the outlines of trees beyond the clearing. Thunder rolled far off, distant and restrained. Inside the bunkhouse, the crew gathered quietly, boots lined along the wall, tin cups warming hands chilled by damp air. Eleanor remained in the supply shack, reviewing the new braces through the window, counting seconds between lightning and sound. Caleb stepped inside beside her, removing his hat and setting it on the desk. "You saw it coming before I did," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I watched the river," she answered. "It always tells first." Rain tapped against the roof in steady rhythm. Outside, the reinforced stacks held firm, ropes straining but not snapping, would secure against the push of wind. The camp endured without chaos. No scrambling, no shouted confusion, just preparation meeting pressure. Hours later, as the storm drifted east and the clouds thinned, the ridge emerged washed and clean. Lantern light flickered back to life across the clearing, reflecting in shallow puddles along the ground. The men stepped outside, surveying the camp in quiet relief. Nothing had been lost. No stacks collapsed. No tools scattered. Stability had held. Caleb walked beside Eleanor toward the edge of the clearing where the trees opened to a view of the valley below. Mist rose gently from the forest floor, drifting like breath after effort. "You changed the way this place stands," he said, voice low against the hush that followed the storm. Eleanor looked out over the ridge, tall pines rising straight despite wind and rain. "It was always strong," she replied. "It only needed to know it." The sky above them cleared fully, revealing a deep indigo scattered with early stars. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm had tested the camp the way the town once tested her, measuring resilience without mercy. And just as before, she had not bent. The ridge stood intact, the river flowing steady below, and North Ridge felt less like a temporary refuge and more like something built to last. The morning after the storm felt different. The air was cleaner, sharper, as if the ridge itself had been rinsed of doubt. Sunlight filtered through branches still heavy with droplets, scattering silver across the clearing. North Ridge woke slowly, but with purpose. Men stepped from the bunkhouse and paused, looking around as if confirming the camp was truly intact. It was. Every stack stood firm. Every rope held. Eleanor Hart walked the perimeter before breakfast, boots pressing into damp earth, fingers brushing along secured beams. She did not search for damage. She searched for weakness. There was none. Caleb Granger joined her near the riverbank, where the current moved fuller from the rain, but remained controlled within its banks. "You were right about the braces," he said quietly. Eleanor looked at the water reflecting morning light. "Preparation is quieter than repair," she replied. The words settled between them, steady as the trees above. By mid-morning, a rider approached from town, horse stepping carefully over softened ground. It was not Ezekiel Crow this time. It was the store clerk, hat in hand, posture hesitant. He dismounted and approached Caleb first, glancing once toward Eleanor. "There is talk in town," he began. Some of the other camps have taken notice. They are asking how North Ridge stayed so secure. Caleb did not answer immediately. He turned slightly toward Eleanor. She understood the question before it was spoken. She stepped forward, hands folded calmly before her. You prepare early, she said. You count honestly. You secure what you build before the wind tests it. The clerk nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of it. They wish to know if you would be willing to show them, he added. A faint murmur moved through the crew nearby, not boastful, not eager, but aware of what that request meant. Respect had traveled further than rumor. Caleb looked to Eleanor again, not seeking permission, but partnership. We will show them, he said at last. But they must be willing to listen. The clerk mounted his horse and rode back toward town, carrying more than a message. He carried proof that strength did not always shout. The day unfolded steady and bright. Eleanor returned to the shack, adjusting columns in the ledger for the week ahead. Outside, the axes rose and fell in rhythm, confident and unhurried. Caleb paused at the doorway, watching her work, sunlight catching the edge of her hair. You did not just hold this place together, he said softly. You raised its standard. Eleanor did not look up from the page. Standards were always there, she answered. They only needed to be seen. Beyond the ridge, other camps prepared for the next storm without knowing when it would come. At North Ridge, preparation was no longer reaction. It was habit. As afternoons stretched long and clear, the woman once measured by a doorway now measured the future in steady columns and anchored beams, and the ridge stood taller because she had chosen not to bow. The following week brought visitors to the ridge, not out of curiosity alone, but out of necessity. Wagons from 2 neighboring camps creaked up the incline just after sunrise, wheels cutting shallow lines into the earth still firm from the last storm. Men stepped down cautiously, hats in hand, scanning the orderly stacks of timber and the secure bracing along the lower ground. They were not there to mock. They were there to learn. Eleanor Hart stood beside the supply shack with a ledger tucked beneath her arm, sunlight catching the edge of its worn cover. Caleb Granger greeted the foreman with a steady handshake, no pride in his posture, only welcome. You wish to see how we prepare, he said. The visiting men nodded. One of them glanced at Eleanor, recognition flickering across his expression. He had been present in town the day laughter followed her across the boardwalk. Now he looked at her differently, measuring not height, but composure. Eleanor stepped forward without hesitation. Preparation begins before the sky darkens, she said calmly. You secure the low ground first. You brace against angles, not force. And you count honestly, so that no one stands uncertain when the wind arrives. The men listened, not interrupting. She walked them along the perimeter, pointing out where additional planks had been reinforced, where ropes were doubled instead of stretched thin, where logs were stacked with space for shifting rather than pressed tight. Caleb added details about timing river releases and adjusting weight before rain swelled the current. There was no boasting in his tone, only clarity. By midday, the visiting crews were taking notes in small pocketbooks, eyes scanning the ridge as though seeing it anew. One younger foreman paused beside Eleanor near the riverbank. It seems simple when you say it, he admitted. She looked at the steady flow of water, sunlight flashing across its surface. It is simple, she replied. Simple does not mean easy. It means consistent. The wind moved gently through the pines above them, bending branches in quiet demonstration. After hours of observation, the wagons turned back toward town, carrying more than instruction. They carried example. As the dust settled from their departure, Caleb stood beside Eleanor again at the edge of the clearing. You have given them something they did not know they lacked, he said softly. Eleanor considered the ridge, the men returning to their tasks with quiet assurance. They lacked proof, she answered, not ability. The afternoon light softened across North Ridge, and the camp resumed its steady rhythm. No applause followed the visitors' departure. No grand declarations were made. Only work continued, balanced and secure. And in that ordinary continuation lay the truest measure of change, not in how high she stood against the doorway, but in how firmly the ground beneath her now held. The ridge wore the color of late autumn now, gold and deep green stitched beneath a sky that seemed wider than it had months before. North Ridge moved without strain, each day unfolding with the quiet confidence of a place that knew its own strength. Eleanor Hart stood at the edge of the clearing just after sunrise, ledger closed in her hands, watching the men guide another line of timber toward the river. The current caught the logs smoothly, carrying them downstream in steady procession. Nothing jammed. Nothing faltered. Caleb Granger approached from behind, boots steady on familiar ground. "It runs clean," he said. Eleanor nodded, eyes following the last log as it slipped around the bend. "Because we do," she replied. There was no pride in her voice, only truth. Word had settled across the valley by now. Other camps had adjusted their braces. Wages were counted more carefully. Foremen listened before the wind forced them to. The town that once measured her against a doorframe no longer spoke of inches. It spoke of methods, of fairness, of a ridge that did not lose timber when storms came. Later that afternoon, a small group from town walked up the incline without wagon or horse, simply on foot. Among them was the man who had once withdrawn his offer without meeting her eyes. He removed his hat as he stepped into the clearing. "Miss Hart," he began, voice quieter than she remembered. "I wish to offer an apology." The camp did not pause its work, but ears turned slightly, listening without spectacle. Eleanor faced him calmly, the breeze lifting a strand of hair from her cheek. "You owe no apology," she said. "You made a choice based on what you saw." He swallowed, glancing briefly at the orderly stacks, the steady crew, the ledger tucked beneath her arm. "I did not see clearly," he admitted. Eleanor's gaze did not harden. It did not soften either. "Clarity comes with time," she replied. "What matters is what you do with it." He nodded once, hat still in hand, then stepped back without further words. No triumph crossed her face. No resentment lingered. Caleb watched from a short distance, understanding that dignity does not require audience. As the sun lowered behind the ridge, lanterns were lit one by one, small constellations forming across the camp. Supper simmered, laughter rose easy and unforced, and the river carried its steady line of timber into the fading light. Eleanor stood beside Caleb near the highest point of the clearing, where the trees framed the horizon. "You were never too tall," he said quietly, not as comfort, but as recognition. She looked out across the valley where town rooftops caught the last glow of day. "I was simply standing where I belonged," she answered. The wind moved through the pines, bending branches in a soft, unified sway. Out here, nothing asked her to shrink. Nothing demanded she fit beneath a lower frame. The ridge did not measure. It endured. And as night settled fully over North Ridge, the woman once judged by height stood grounded by something far stronger, her worth no longer debated, only lived.